Welcome to HITLAB and Women's Health Tech Wednesday. We are thrilled that you joined us this week and look forward to the next 30 minutes with you. My name is Susan Solinsky, and I'm the Chief Growth Officer of Ellipsis Health. Ellipsis Health is a machine learning health tech company that detects depression and anxiety through a few minutes of patient speech. I am also privileged to be the Director of the Women's Health Tech Initiative. Joining us today is the amazing Delphine O'Rourke, who is a partner with Goodwin. Delphine is nationally recognized for her work with FemTech founders and is a huge supporter of women-led businesses. Our vision at Women's Health Tech Initiative is to improve women's health around the world by enabling women to have access to funding and scaling healthcare innovation through content, connectivity, and capital. We have a series of events throughout the year supporting the FemTech community. Today's conversation is especially exciting because we are going to discuss with Delphine everything you want to know about legal services for your FemTech startup. Start thinking about your questions as Delphine will outline some of the ways to make sure your startup is ready to scale, why it matters to be set up correctly, and key areas to consider upfront. Please introduce yourself to each other and to us in the chat, and also add in your questions. Delphine has been an incredible friend to HITLAB. Last year, Goodwin was our lead sponsor, and Delphine played an important leadership role at the HITLAB Women's Health Tech Challenge. On a very personal note, I'm honored to have this conversation as she's an inspiring leader, and I always want to have her in my world. So Delphine, would you please introduce your background, your practice, and what led you to focus on women's health?
Sure, Susan, thank you. And thank you to HITLAB and for that generous introduction, and for all the founders who are joining us today. You're the reason that we're here, and you inspire us with the work that you're doing and the solutions that you're solving the greatest issues in healthcare and the greatest issues that face women. So grateful to you. So, my background is, I'll just start with, I feel very fortunate to be able to, pursue my passion. I say that it took a while to be able to get to a position where I spend the majority of my time advising founders and companies and investors in women's health, because women's health was very different. When I first started, it was very focused on GYN and OBs and working with traditional service providers. And it brings together, my passions for women, the law, and healthcare. And I think particularly now, we're in a really pivotal point in the transformation generally of our healthcare system. I mean, COVID has really exacerbated many of the challenges that pre-existed. And there's really an opportunity to leverage, a light is shining, it's not bright enough, but shining on women's health. And organizations like the HITLAB and all the work that you do, Susan, both personally and professionally, and investors saying, hey, we're here, this is huge, it's huge across the world. So what can we do to come together as an ecosystem and support each other? So that's where, I hope to play a role, which is advising and partnering with founders to navigate all the legal issues. Because the legal issues aren't necessarily what first comes to mind when you have a fabulous idea and you're seeing that there are results and you're trying to raise money and also have a day job possibly. And then maybe you think about, okay, what's my legal structure and what are the regulatory considerations or the IP considerations? So what I hope to be able to bring to my clients is a comprehensive view. Say, okay, what do we need as a legal strategy? And be that one-stop shop to also make connections for founders to investors, to other healthcare companies that might be interested in collaborating with them. So I feel very fortunate to be able to provide that advice and meet fabulous founders along the way.
Delphine, you're amazing. I really appreciate that. And so thinking about our FemTech founders who are in the audience, we probably have some different stages here. There are going to be some that are just getting started. Some are really likely very well on their way. So what tips would you share with founders around IP, maybe overall legal framework, investor framework, and other areas that we may not consider?
Yeah. And that's a great question, because I say, is you kind of work with a lot of different founders who are coming to legal at different phases. And it's a luxury to be able to look ahead. But if you can, regardless of where you are, to think about not just where you are now, but what do you see in the future? Maybe right now you're, only digital health, thinking, okay, you want to expand to digital health services or telehealth. It might not be tomorrow, it might never be, but to think always, not just today and in advance, because you don't want to be redoing the legal work, structuring a corporate structure. I was having this conversation this morning, C Corp, LLC. Okay, well, those matter, and taking a little time, and then I'll touch on the money, but to think about a comprehensive strategy. And what I find is that founders quickly go to IP, and IP is critically important. And Susan, as you and I have talked about, for a variety of reasons, it can be or has proven more challenging for women founders to protect their IP. And IP is critically important. IP is not the only conversation. So, if you're going to be practicing medicine, corporate practice of medicine considerations, if you're providing telehealth or telewellness or teleresearch, there are regulations around that. Accounting considerations when you're thinking about, how you're going to incentivize your employees, what stock options. So, and that's something, we offer clients saying, okay, sort of here's a checklist. So securities law considerations, what are your tax considerations? Nonprofit issues. If you're going to be contracting with large parties, look at your indemnification so that you're not getting to a point where, again, see this frequently, where founders will come to me and say, okay, I want to be raising money and I want, I'm past my initial seed round. And we look at their model and there's a real a regulatory obstacle. Telehealth is a great example, right? And the model doesn't necessarily consider all the variations in the telehealth regs. So that's, comprehensive solution. So another, sort of, this is just an inside tip, is I'll hear, well, it's too expensive to get a lawyer at the outset. Well, I would suggest, talking to a lawyer, approaching and saying, okay, maybe right now I'm not a public company, but what you're doing is investing in me and in my potential. And therefore, would you be willing to negotiate what we call alternative fee arrangements? And I do that with, almost all of our clients, where we say, okay, what can you afford? How can we make this work? So, I guess my last comment would be just, don't let the concern over legal prevent your legal fees, prevent you, because you're going to end up doing it. And if it's not done correctly, it's going to cost you more money in the long run.
That's really, I as a former founder, I think that, how valuable you and I have talked about. That's such an important lesson for all of us. Justin, I have a favor. Would you be kind enough to enable the chat? I think we have a male ally here. We're so excited. And he had a question. So if you could enable the chat, that would be great. So Delphine, let's follow a little bit up on that. So we touched on some of the obstacles that could happen and some of the reasons why it's important to be set up correctly. What are some of the laws that are critical for founders to consider? And how do they make sure they're not missing a key regulation that will impact their ability to scale?
So that's a great question. And I'll start with how do you not miss? And I'll go back to telehealth, because telehealth has gotten so much attention and there's so much crossover with digital health in the space. So new legislation passed today in Illinois, for example, that provides for parity, payment parity for telehealth. So if you are focusing on a specific area, and let's say DERM reimbursement is going to be important for you, or telehealth laws, it is really critical to make sure that you stay ahead of it and you know what's coming down the pike. Because if there's a regulation that's been proposed that could potentially negatively impact your business, you want to know about it when you're building it out, but also investors will ask. I mean, that's what they, as I mentioned, we represent investors. Investors will ask me, okay, not just as part of due diligence, but even before then, what in the regulatory framework is going to happen that could make this either a more interesting investment or higher risk? So there are free online services. There's GovTrack, where you can put in a topic and let's say you say maternal health or diabetes, and it'll track what type of legislation has been introduced, where it stands. And that you can do that for free. So particularly with healthcare that changes, their new healthcare laws every day. I'm not exaggerating. And with the new administration, hopefully we'll have an opportunity to talk about what we can expect from the new administration. It is critical for innovators to stay on top of that.
Yeah, that's really key. I mean, what I love about what you've built with your FemLaw practices, you also do represent funders. So can you talk a little bit about the different funding vehicles for FemTech founders? Because I think that landscape has changed a lot, particularly in the last 12 months.
It's changed. And, what's interesting is that, right when COVID hit, there was this pause, particularly private equity, VC, and there's this prediction that, there had been such growth in PE investment overall in healthcare that COVID was going to really freeze it. And actually, I did some interviews, wrote some pieces on the topic, and very quickly, there was this sort of temporary pause, and within 6 weeks, I'd say to 2 months, we saw activity really start spiking up, and it has continued to do so. And because certain funders are not putting their money into, their entire industries now that are a lot more at risk, hospitality, travel, that we've seen an uptick in interest and money available for healthcare funding. There's a lot of cash out there. I mean, our deal volumes right now are incredibly high. So, so there's money, you funders want it. How do you connect and what type? So, we know generally, we've got the sort of bootstrapping initially, maybe the founders put their money together and say, okay, this is what we can come up with. And then when that's not enough, or, you have some founders say, I don't have any money to put in. And frankly, a friends and family round isn't within my circle, right? And we could have a whole conversation around gender equity and sort of racial equity in that space. And if you don't have friends and family in your sphere who can fund, then, we start looking at seed financing and, looking at investors, usually it's a moderate amount of capital, and looking at, even there at the level of the investors still see themselves as friends of the company and not as distance of a relationship as you'll see with, for example, private equity, or once you start getting into notes, convertible notes. Then you have venture capital funding. Now, usually when we're talking about VC funding, that's when we're not talking about, 25 grand. And we're talking about significant amounts of money for much more mature funders. Most of the founders who are, sort of startup emerging come to us when they're, they've already done the pre-seed and they're sort of in seed Series A funding. Although I was talking to a founder this morning and they were talking about we were talking about a Series C. So, and hopefully we'll get into this as well, is one of the things that you want to think about, whether it's the seed round or friends and family, is who are you giving equity to? What kind of notes are you giving out? Because at a time when, founders understandably really need cash, there can be this sort of hurry to get cash in exchange for equity. And then, further on, while you're scaling and having success, all of a sudden looking around saying, wow, I've given away a lot of equity and what do I have left?
That's actually, that leads me a little bit to my next topic. I talked to you that one of the common threads that I see with some of the FemTech founders that I've invested in is not understanding how to set up their cap table correctly. So I think it's actually really hard, and we should all just own that it's hard. And so maybe talk a little bit about those first convertible notes, if you're using that vehicle, and then also if you could describe a little bit about why it matters to have a clean cap table. And also, I think it also matters for the team. So we're all attracting and building really extraordinary teams. And so how are you interacting with your team, and how are you interacting with your investors? So you've got that's serving both purposes.
Sure. And I smile because cap tables, it's like enough of the Excel, right? Everybody uses Excel, and right? Because when you start out, Excel sounds great. There are also some other options out there in the market, that aren't expensive, that are really, again, because you might not be thinking when it's just you in your, proverbial garage about, oh, I'm going to need a cap table. And then because we're all, sending you energy for success, hopefully 2 years from now, there are going to be a lot of entries in your cap table, So again, thinking ahead and saying, okay, if I'm projecting myself 5 years from now, do I really want to go to a mature investor with an Excel spreadsheet with tabs that, I've got to do pivot tables? So again, thinking ahead. So getting back to the cap table, and this morning I working on a deal. So this is an acquisition, and the seller's cap table is such a mess. And we don't, there's lack of documentation, and we'll touch on documentation, that we've decided to go in a completely different corporate structure for the deal because the cap table is such a mess. And even after having lawyers on both sides, no one's quite sure who owns what, right? And this is a deal for, we're probably looking at between 50 and 60 million. So you'd think, okay, you would have maybe thought of, hiring someone to clean up your cap table. You'd be amazed at how sloppy they can be. So why is it important? Well, first of all, your investors, as I just shared in that story, want to know, well, what am I getting? First of all, how many notes are out there? Are they convertible notes? How many shares are out there? Who owns the shares? Is the cousin and the ex-husband? Like, what is the risk in this? Are all the shares owned by one person, one group? Have they been diluted? I mean, that's another thing that we see frequently as founders are looking to raise cash, saying, okay, well, let me issue some more shares and let me issue some more shares. So that also sends, and in addition to your cap table, documents, and that might sound basic, but keep track. You're sending an email, your communication, keep track of that documentation. Because again, looking ahead, when you're going to go through due diligence and lawyers like me say, well, please provide us with the documentation supporting your cap table. And the seller sort of, responds with, well, we can't find it, or we're not sure where it is. A, that creates risk, and you're going to be paying for the risk one way or the other. And B, that doesn't really communicate to investors, if they haven't really bought into you yet, that your ship is in shape, right? You don't know who owns what. So investors critically important, and to understand, okay, who has preferred stock if you're giving her preferred stock, who has common stock, what's their address. Again, seems basic, but you'd be amazed at how many times that's a source of fumble. The other piece is when you're talking about sort of internally, Susan, you want transparency. To encourage new investors and your existing investors, even your employees to whom you've given stock options so that they have skin in the game, you want them to still feel like, wait a second, I'm still part of this, I'm valued, this is a company that's being true to our original mission and isn't giving, because again, that's often or can be a source of tension, isn't issuing stock on the side that we're not aware of. So best practice is don't use Excel. And if if that's what you decide to do, really make sure that you document everything, every change, and that you are so meticulous about it, and then share both internally and with your investors updated cap tables on a regular basis.
I think that's such a great point, because I think a lot of FemTech founders have incredible vision, and remembering to stop for a minute and document, that's not easy. So for all of our FemTech founders out there, that means someone on your team needs to be behind you, supporting you, and really documenting. Hey,
and you're in your mission, and you're thinking about your vision, and you're working, 27 hours a day, and you're thinking, oh, well, my best friend Susan. Okay, but investors saying, okay, well, who's Susan? What's her info? And so looking at it, try to be objective and think about it. If I was an investor, what would I be looking for?
Exactly. So we have a great question from the audience. I think I love the enthusiasm. So, okay, we're building our companies, and then we're working really hard. We have a lot of impact. We're serving the community. What are the paths to exit that you see for FemTech?
How about you read it? Because for some reason I can't see the chat. So, so thanks for reading the chats.
Yeah.
So paths to exit, right? That's often a question. Because to me, path to exit is an emotional question too, right? In that your cap table, okay, maybe it's in the friends and the family round. There could be some emotion connected to that. But really, when you start thinking about your exit, it's how do you see yourself? Is this your, proverbial baby and you can't imagine ever selling it? Do you want to run it? How do you see yourself? Are you comfortable? And we'll have this negotiation. They'll say, okay, well, I want to sell, but then I want to continue to control how my baby, grows. So think about that also sort of emotionally, legally. What are the main paths? I think of 4 main paths, successful paths, obviously. We're looking at successful paths. So a strategic sale or merger, as we're referencing that this morning, you've created a valuable asset. So, you're building your company, as you point out, you're making a difference, you're having an impact, and there's value to that impact, right? Because we can say I'm having impact, but how do you measure your impact? Which, for some of our visions, we need to think about, okay, we know it, we hear it, but how are we going to show value? Very quickly somebody say, well, what's your valuation? So, you've built this and you want to, either merge with a larger entity or an equal entity or sell it, and off it goes and you receive the value of your hard work. Other founders will say, no, I want to scale it. I've been actively involved. I want to grow it. This is a longer term play for me. I've been committed to this. When I was talking to a founder yesterday who's already, we're talking about, sort of project 1, company 1, and they're already telling me about the next one. Like their mind is already like, I'm going to sell this one. I'm on to my next idea. And some founders say, no, this is going to be my 20-year, 30-year. So to think about what suits you in the sense of, are you a new idea, love building companies, sell them, or do you want to really scale this and then look at exits in the future? Own passively. You build something and you're gonna grow it and grow it enough that you can have an ownership interest, but you don't want to run the day-to-day, right? Either because you're on to another idea or because it's just, others at the point where you've scaled it would be more creative, whatever your reasons, or you want to hang out on a beach, in the Caribbean. You say, I'm going to be a passive investor, continue to share my knowledge and leadership, but not be involved in the daily grind. And then there's the IPO, and IPO activity is hot. And I think part of our responsibility as women and men in women's health is to, every time there's a success, to really shout it out, because there currently isn't a long list of IPOs in the FemTech space that investors can look to or that founders can look to. So I'm not saying quite the contrary. There's no reason you couldn't, but it's going to be more trailblazing than, let's say, an oncology drug.
Yep, that's just a reminder, I think, of a little bit of how complicated the FemTech space is. And there's so much opportunity, and there are some amazing women and some FemTech companies that are up and coming. I think we're going to see a lot of change in the next couple of years. I'm really optimistic about where this is all heading. Can we change topics a little bit? We have a new administration. So I'd love, you're well known for how you monitor things. Would you be kind enough to tell us a little bit about the laws that you think we might see? And what are some of the big legal issues that FemTech founders need to be thinking about in 2021?
So do we have 3 more hours for this? 4 more hours? Where do we begin, right? So, and we could start, incarcerated women. I mean, there's so much. So for that we hope will change and better. For FemTech founders, I think what we're going to see, I'll step back, is focus on access, right? Access to care. And again, going back to the lessons learned of COVID, what did we learn? We learned that we have major access crises. We did before, and then COVID showed, wow, you can't even get into an emergency room, and emergency rooms used to be the ultimate place of access. You could go anytime, anywhere, and for anything, even if it wasn't necessarily an emergent condition. And then all of a sudden, we were seeing lines out of emergency rooms with COVID sufferers trying to get in. And that's a real wake up and saying, wait a second. We knew we had access issues around mental health. We knew that there were coverage issues, but this is a lot more widespread. And I think this is where, for FemTech, there's a real opportunity. How do you increase access? In my opinion, tech's the answer, and in a lot of different ways. And the idea that you need to physically be present in a brick and mortar location to access your health. Of course, there are going to be some specialties where you need to, right? We're doing some in remote, great advancements in robotic surgery, but we're not quite there yet. So that's the opportunity, and we're going to see more money for women-owned small businesses. So if you're not tapping into that, right? It's 2%, if not greater, of small businesses in the US are owned by women. Same with new businesses, we're over 50%. And the Biden administration is funding women-owned small businesses in a way that have not been previously funded. So if you haven't reached out, do. Coverage, again, hoping to see, and I think we will, what we have to get around is the tech obstacles as far as access to broadband, et cetera, but more coverage. And even if right now you're not working with government payers, just more creative ways to access tech that are reimbursed and legal. The regulations have been barriers in many ways to expanding technology. And, the Biden administration is very focused on increasing that access. Obviously, there's going to be but there's going to be a lot of activity around the ACA, around contraception, if you're in that space, trying to roll back some of the Trump era legislation that limited women's ability to access contraception. Yeah, I would focus on small businesses and then access and say, okay, one of the big myths that was debunked during COVID is that tech was for young people. And therefore, FemTech was for women's issues for young people. Young people, no one over 20 deals with tech. And that has been completely debunked, or maybe not completely, but in large part debunked. So for you as digital health and FemTech, that's a whole potential market that you knew was there. But there's now a public acceptance that, guess what? Your grandmother much prefers to use Facebook to get information, or her phone, than to go into a hospital at this point. So again, I'd focus on great regulations, going back to my prior comment, track them, small businesses, women-owned, access to tech, and tech-enabled solutions, being relaxed regulations.
Wonderful words. You and I've talked about this a lot, that one of my big issues is the stigma and misconceptions around what the FemTech wording is. And that's a conversation for another day. So this is all reminding me about one of my favorite things about you, that your clients describe you as more than just a lawyer. And I don't think that that's common, actually. I think it's something very special about you. So how did you get that? What are you doing, and how are you becoming a key part of their team?
So, I'm proud to be a lawyer, and I'm proud to also not just be a lawyer. And there's stigma around lawyers, that lawyers always say no, and lawyers just give, I feel very fortunate to be able to be a strategic partner to my clients, and whether it's, introductions to investors, whether it's, just being part of the ecosystem, a sounding board. I was talking to a client this morning and she said, guess what? Nike's asked me to speak, and she's nervous. So I said, well, okay. I mean, I get that you're nervous. That's a big deal. So, we worked together on what that would look like, and also how do we communicate it. So, I think the short answer is I don't see myself as just a lawyer. I see myself, and I think my clients do too, as being one of their partners, or huge support. I don't want to use the word cheerleader because I'm so uncoordinated that I would never be the cheerleader. But someone who's just such an advocate of the mission, because I believe in it. At the end of the day, I dedicate my energy to women's health and FemTech because I want to improve the lives of women. Like, if I improve one person's life, so it's my energy, it's my passion, it's my enthusiasm. And if I can communicate that to the world so that they look at you and you have a sound legal framework, then it's all good.
Delphine, you are so incredible. I have to tell you, we could talk for hours. So we're almost at the end here. So final thoughts, anything that we missed today? We did put in the chat your LinkedIn. People should feel free to please reach out to Delphine there, as we know she's an incredible supporter and advocate for female-led companies, and really nationally known for all of her work with FemTech founders. Anything else you want to add as we're wrapping up today?
I'd say, reach out, right? I do believe this. It's like, you never know who knows somebody, or just somebody might give you advice, and say, did you think about this? A different set of eyes. Every time I talk to a founder, whether they're a client or not, I learn something, and I really value that exchange. So I would say, every opportunity that you have to reach out, what's the worst that people are going to say? No? Okay. So you don't care. But to really reach out and connect, so please do so with me, and I'd be happy to connect you with others. That ecosystem, and Susan and HITLAB are prime examples. They've created an ecosystem that is invaluable, and I think everyone who's part of it is just thrilled to connect and share.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think one of the things I love about you is you're such a strong advocate of building community and supporting, and you're so generous with your counsel. So really appreciate it. And thanks to all of you for listening. We really appreciate you being here. It means so much to us. And I think Justin's put up our next event with Michelle Lucci from Digital DX. And please don't forget to check out more events at our website. And Delphine, thank you again so much. It was really an honor to be here, true privilege. And we're both going to sign off, and we wish you all a happy, healthy, and safe week. Thank you.
Thank you.